Now we can put together supply and demand. We cannot analyze the market unless we put together supply and demand. So there are two sides. There are always two sides in the market. So let's put together supply and demand. A very important concept in economics is the equilibrium. So the equilibrium refers to a situation in which the price has reached a level where the quantity supplied equals quantity demanded. So in other words, at the market equilibrium, the market clears. The quantity supply is equal to the quantity demanded. So people who want to buy, who are willing and able to buy the goods and services at the price, are going to get the quantity they want. And people who are willing and able to sell the goods at the price, they are going to sell the quantity they want. Okay, so everybody is kind of happy. Okay, so this situation is kind of stable, what we call stable, until the next shock comes. In a classroom setting, unless you are otherwise told, when we talk about the market price, the market quantity, we're looking at the equilibrium. We mean the equilibrium. So unless we're otherwise told in a classroom setting, we assume the market price to be the equilibrium price, the market quantity to be the equilibrium quantity. In reality, that's probably not the case always, but in a free market where the government has very little intervention, which is probably the case of the United States, then we assume that even if the market is not at the equilibrium, it will come back to the equilibrium very quickly. So it's not too off track in a classroom setting to assume the market price to be the equilibrium price. So let's look at an example to see how we identified an equilibrium. Okay, so we have on the left hand side a demand schedule which we can use to plot a demand curve, and on the right hand side a supply schedule which we can use to plot a supply curve. Okay, so you can see that at 50 cents, people are willing and able to buy 16 units. So the quantity demanded in the market is 16. But at 50 cents, the quantity supplied is 0. No seller is willing and able to sell an ice cream cone at 50 cents. So when you look at these schedules here, can we find the equilibrium? I'm sure many of you can spot right away that the equilibrium occurs when the price is equal to 2. Okay? So at $2, the quantity demanded is equal to the quantity supplied. So the equilibrium price is $2 and the equilibrium quantity is 7 ice cream cone. So graphically, this is how we illustrate an equilibrium. The equilibrium occurs at the intersection between the demand curve and the supply curve. So when you recall what you learned in math class, at the intersection, the quantity supplied is equal to the quantity demanded. Okay? So and the corresponding price is $2. So that's the equilibrium price. Okay? So what happens when we're not at the equilibrium. So in a classroom setting, unless we're otherwise told, we assume that the market is at the equilibrium. But what happens if we're not at the equilibrium? So another word for it is disequilibrium, right? So one of the cases where the market is not at the equilibrium is when the market has a surplus. Okay? So we're going to come back to this slide soon, okay? But right now it's probably easier if we look at the diagram. Okay, so the equilibrium occurs at $2, okay? But for some reason, the market price is not at $2. So now we know we have a case where the market is not at the equilibrium. So the market price is $2.50. So what happens when the market price is $2.50? You look at the quantity supplied, that's 10. So sellers, of course, are happy with this higher price, right? So sellers are willing and able to sell 10 ice cream cones. But the problem here is buyers are not happy. Buyers are not so happy with this higher price, so buyers are willing and able to buy only 4 ice cream cones. Okay, so at $2.50, okay, so the quantity demanded is at 4 ice cream cones. So there's a gap here. Okay, we have more quantity supplied than quantity demanded. So more sellers would want to sell ice cream cones than what buyers are willing and able to buy. So in other words, we have a surplus. Okay? So some people prefer to use another word called excess supply. Okay, but in economics, a lot of times we use the word surplus. That's when the quantity supply is greater than quantity demanded. So the supply, the size of the surplus, as you can see, is 6 units, 6 ice cream cones. We have 6 ice cream cones in excess. Okay. So we go back to the previous slide. Okay. So when price is greater than the equilibrium price, when the market price is higher than the equilibrium price, then quantity supplied is greater than quantity demanded. There is a surplus or an excess supply. Suppliers will lower the price to increase sales, thereby moving toward equilibrium. The quantity supplied decreases and the quantity demanded increases in the process. What does that mean? Well, come back to this. In a free market where the government intervenes very little in the market, so let the buyers and sellers make their own decisions. So if that's the case, this surplus will not last long. Okay? Because what happens when we have a surplus like this? I mean, imagine you were a seller, okay? So of course you're happy to charge $2.50, okay? But you wait and wait on the beach for hours, okay? On a very hot day, okay? And nobody buys ice cream cones from you. At some point, you may want to ask yourself, well, do I still want to wait any longer, or do I want to go home? So if I want to go home, I may have to think of a way to get rid of the ice cream that I have. Okay, it will melt soon too. So very likely, some sellers will try to lower the price to lure more customers, okay, so that they can go home. Okay, so what we observe is the price will start to come down from $2.50, maybe $2.20. Okay, so at $2.20, okay, you will see that the quantity supplied decreases. You see the movement along the supply curve. okay? Because some sellers are not happy to sell at 220. Some of them will say, well, it's really not worth my while. I'll just go home. I just go home, quit selling. I'll just go home and watch TV. So we have a decrease in quantity supply as the price comes down. At the same time, as the price comes down, 220 for example, some buyers now are drawn to the market. Previously, they were not happy with 250, but now the price has come down a bit to 220. Some buyers may say, well, it's a hot day, my kids are complaining. So why don't I buy some ice cream? I think 220 is a good price. So some buyers are drawn to the market. We see a movement along the demand curve, okay, a rightward movement specifically. So an increase in quantity demanded as the price comes down. So this process continues until the price comes to the equilibrium price at $2. So the market clears. Okay? So in a free market and in efficient market, most likely like the one in the United States, this process will take place very quickly and will come back to the equilibrium very quickly. Okay? So next case, shortage. Okay. So once again, let's look at the diagram before we look at the words. Okay. So this is the equilibrium. This is when the market is at equilibrium. But for some reason, in this case, the market price is not the equilibrium price. So the market is not at the equilibrium in this case. Okay. So what we have here is the market price is 150. And what you can see here is the quantity demanded is 10 ice cream cone. Buyers, of course, are happy with a lower price. Okay? And then at the same time, at 150, some sellers are not happy. Okay? So instead of 7 ice cream cones, the quantity supplied is 4 ice cream cones. So we clearly have a gap here. The market doesn't clear. Okay, so this gap here is called a shortage. Okay, so at 150, the quantity demanded is greater than the quantity supplied. So more people want to buy than the people who want to sell, or people want to buy more quantity than what the sellers are willing to sell. Okay, so we have a shortage of 6 ice cream cones here. Okay, so what happens in this case? Okay. Oh, by the way, shortage is also called excess demand. Okay? So in a free and efficient market where the government doesn't really regulate much what the buyers and sellers can do, very likely this shortage will not last long. Okay? Because at 150 we have a shortage, so we have buyers who are chasing ice cream cones, who are chasing goods. Okay? So it's a very hot day. Just imagine, you have your kids there with you on a beach. Of course you are happy to pay 150, but you find that everywhere you go it's so crowded, long lines. At 150, everybody is buying ice cream cone. So it is very hard for you to actually wait for hours and hours in line, so you cannot get the ice cream cone. So your kids are getting very cranky. So what you're likely to do is probably, well, you will just, wave your dollar bills and say, hey, I'm willing to buy, at 170. Who wants to sell? Some kids, there are kids, selling ice cream cones on the beach. Some kids may actually see you and say, hey, are you paying 170? Okay, so why not? Because everywhere else is charging 150. So I am selling my ice cream cone to you. So other parents see that. Other parents also start to, bid up the price. They also paid 170, 180, 190. So what happens here is the price comes up. So let's say the price comes up to 170. What you can see here is the quantity demanded decreases as the price comes up. Okay? Because some parents may say, some people will say, well, I don't want to pay 170 for ice cream. So I would just, buy something else. So they drop out of the market. At the same time, when the price goes up, to 170, for example, some of the sellers are drawn to the market. Some of the people who previously watched TV at home, they heard from their friends that now, well, the price of ice cream cone has gone up significantly. Some of the people will say, well, it is worth my while to get some part-time, income. So yeah, I would just grab, whatever ice cream I have in inventory and then go sell. So we will have an increase in quantity supplied, a rightward movement along the supply curve, okay? Not shift. Be very careful here. We don't have a shift here, okay? So very quickly, okay, so in an efficient market, we should expect this process to happen very quickly. The price will keep going up until it reaches $2 and the market clears. Okay, so people were willing to pay $2, willing and able to pay $2, they get the ice cream cone they want, and people were willing and sell at $2, they get to sell the quantity they want. So the market clears. Okay, so we come back to the equilibrium again. Okay. So to summarize what we have just seen in the diagram, when the market price is less than the equilibrium price, then the quantity demanded is greater than quantity supply. There is an excess demand or a shortage. So eventually supplies will raise the price due to too many buyers chasing too few goods, thereby moving toward the equilibrium. Quantity demanded decreases and quantity supply increases in the process. Okay, so we put together supply and demand, and now let's talk about how we analyze the market. So once again, unless we are otherwise told, when we are looking at the market, we're looking at the equilibrium. Okay. So this is the initial equilibrium, $2, 7 ice cream cones, okay? And then there's a shock, okay? So there is a shock. What's the shock? Well, hot weather. So the weather is very, very hot. So when we recall the list of the determinants of demand, okay, so this is something that will affect the demand side because it affects taste and preferences. When the weather is hot, people prefer to have something cold, like an ice cream. So hot weather is likely to increase the demand for ice cream. So it is an increase in demand, so as illustrated by a rightward shift of the demand curve. So to complete the analysis, we also need to describe what happens to the equilibrium. Okay, so what happens to the equilibrium? You can see that we have a new equilibrium here. What happens here is the price goes up, right? And the quantity increases. So when the weather gets hot, what we are likely to observe at the end is higher price for ice cream cones and more people buy and sell ice cream cones. Okay, so that completes our analysis. Another one. So once again, our initial equilibrium at $2 and then the quantity at 7 units, 7 ice cream cones. Okay, so there is a shock, but this time it comes from the supply side. there is an increase in the price of sugar. So think about how sugar and ice cream cones are related. Okay? Are they complements? Are they substitutes? No, right? The price of sugar, so how is the price of sugar related to ice cream? So some of you may start to think that, well, sugar, we need sugar to make ice cream, right? Okay. So that means sugar is an input. When you recall the determinants of supply, you can find that the price of input is one of the factors that will influence the supply. So as the price of sugar goes up, as the price of input goes up, sellers are less willing and able to sell as much, okay? Because the cost of making ice cream goes up. So therefore, we have a decrease in the supply of ice cream. And you can see that we now have a new equilibrium at here, okay? So the price goes up, okay, and the quantity decreases, okay? So eventually, when the price of sugar goes up, what we are likely to observe is more expensive ice cream cones, and fewer people get to eat ice cream cones, okay? So that completes our analysis. Okay? So I hope this will help you understand how we use the supply and demand framework to analyze a market. Okay? So these are some of the results, some of the summaries of the outcome of each combinations of changes in supply and demand. Okay? So what we have just seen, for example, is a decrease in supply and no change in demand. So if that's the case, we are likely to see the price goes up, the quantity comes down, right? Okay. But I do not advise you to memorize this table because it's going to be very tough. And the easiest way to know the outcome is to understand how to make use of the supply and demand diagram. Because once you're familiar with the graphical tools here, it is very easy to visualize. I mean, even though you don't write it down or you don't draw the graph, it's very easy to visualize that when we have a decrease in supply and no change in demand, we're going to end up with a higher price and lower quantity. Okay? So this is a good exercise that I'm going to leave you with. Okay? So you're going to take some time to work on these exercise.